Hi guys, we are going to be talking now about visual literacy, wanting to have a vocabulary to describe just the appearances of art. We want to be able to put words to our own vision, just for ourselves, just so we can think more clearly about what we're seeing. We want to be able to communicate what we see to others, and we want to give accurate critiques, so be able to break down the positives and the negatives of any artwork that we see. The first quality of an artwork that you're going to notice when you see it is whether it is representational or not. So representational is a large, we could call it sort of an umbrella term for any work that refers to a real world figure or object. Now both of these images by Picasso are actually representational, even though they're quite distinct, the one on the left being much more naturalistic or realistic, and the one on the right being much more abstract. But when we look at each, we would say, oh, that's a person, and therefore it's representational, depicting a real-world form. Now, underneath representation, we'll see several different kind of subheadings that define that continuum. So under representation, we see some works that are photorealistic. These are images that are realistic, but also specifically feel related to photography. When we look at this oil painting by Richard Estes, we're really amazed by the skill and technique. It's so convincing that you really feel like you're looking at a photograph. It's got the same kind of overall clarity that a lot of cameras do, whereas when we are looking at the world through our eyes, we actually have focal points, and then the rest of our vision is kind of less clear, a little more peripheral, right? But in this image, we feel that kind of photographic clarity across the whole. Another subheading of representation would be naturalistic. And these are images that feel lifelike, feel true to the world around us, and yet not specifically like a photograph. So this image on the left by Bronzino of Eleonora and her son, we feel like we know enough from this image that we could recognize them on the street. We feel like they are obviously being depicted with natural skin tones, very believable fabrics and details of their bodily proportions. So it feels very true to life, very naturalistic. On the right, we're looking at a bust of Caravaggio made in marble. And this image, too, is fairly naturalistic. So you get to see like the furrow of his brow and the kind of consternation in his eyes and the softness of his skin and lips and chin. We might note if we were describing this to someone that we would say, well, it's not naturalistic in color because after all it's made in marble and not painted, but the forms are very naturalistic. Another category under representation would be illusionistic, or another word would be trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil, which literally means in French to fool the eye. So these are works that are, again, representational and fairly naturalistic, but where you can really tell that the artist is trying to fool you. They want you to feel like you could walk up to this painting, in the case of William Harnett. He wants you to feel like you could walk up to it and actually feel the fur on that rabbit, or take that hat off the hook and put it on your head. So they're kind of trying to get us to come up and try to interact with the image, that we would be so fooled by it. So illusionistic or trompe-l'oeil. Idealized is another subheading of representation, and these are images that conform to a culture's highest standard of beauty. Conform to a culture's highest standard of beauty. So the image on the left gives us a sense of what ancient Greeks thought of as very beautiful for the male figure, that the figure would be symmetrical, that this very specific sense of proportion would be in place, that people would carry themselves with this kind of stature and have this kind of muscular detail. And we might say that the ideal standard for the male figure, as represented here by the Greeks, is fairly similar to the one that's still in place in our culture today. On the right, with Cabanel's Birth of Venus, we are also seeing an idealized female figure, a very voluptuous woman with this kind of creamy, very even complexion laying across the waves. And it is interesting that in order to know if an image is idealized, you do have to have some sense of what that culture thinks of as beautiful, because we know that can change even pretty drastically from culture to culture or period to period. And even in our own, say, the last 100 years in the U.S. and in Western culture in general, ideas of female beauty in particularly have shifted at times from very voluptuous figures to other times where it's been very kind of straight, very slender figures. So we do see some changes in what is considered an ideal figure. Stylized work would be work that is representational, but is conforming to a preset convention. Conforming to a preset convention, or conforming to a system of depiction. So here we're not just talking about the style of an individual artist, but a group of artists, or perhaps even a whole culture, that in which the artists really conform to a preset standard. When you look at these works, I'm sure that right away you recognize them as being Egyptian works, right? And even if you haven't studied Egypt very closely on your own, we all recognize Egyptian work because for approximately 3,000 years, most of the arts of Egypt conform to this kind of look, this stylization, where it's an interesting mix of some natural form, so the curve of the shoulders or the facial features. There is a naturalism to it, and yet it just kind of stops short of being fully believable. And so we're very aware of this kind of rigid stance with all Egyptian forms, also in their painted murals as well as here in these sculptural forms. So it's stylized. We could say that similarly with Japanese woodblock prints. And here with Japanese woodblock prints, you will see some more diversity between individual artists. But on the whole, there's kind of a unified look about the Japanese woodblock prints, a very kind of a more flat, sort of shapy quality to the layering that goes into the woodblock prints. So it's stylized, conforms to a standard of depiction. When we come into abstraction and then fully into non-representational works, we're looking at kind of a continuum. So the image on the left, another one by Picasso, is an abstracted representational form. So abstraction in general means that they are real-world forms that have been distorted in some way. Now, of course, an artist might distort the forms so much that a viewer might see them as completely non-representational, that is, works that do not relate to real-world forms. Right? So there could be works that are so abstracted that they appear non-representational, as the image on the right by Mondrian, who began as a naturalistic painter, and through the course of his life and career progressed to much more minimal means, so he actually reduced his palette down to just black and white, red, yellow, and blue, and then only used vertical and horizontal lines. So really greatly reduced the elements that he would let himself use for his compositions. Now, to us, it appears very non-representational, that it doesn't relate to real-world forms. However, in Mondrian's mind, it's still related to the architecture of the world around him, even to cityscapes and sort of an aerial view of a city, almost looking down at like the streets, right? But it's fine that if we don't know the backstory, this work might appear non-representational. Other stops along that continuum from abstract to non-representational, you might include the word abstract when you describe Impressionist work like this one. You might have had the experience where you if you've been in front of an Impressionist work in person, where you stand back across the room and the image comes into focus. And then as you draw near to the work, it almost seems like it's kind of pixelating, we might say now, in front of your eyes, where you become more and more aware of the individual, very painterly brushstrokes or brushy brushstrokes and the individual flicks of paint. So there's a level of abstraction to a Impressionist piece. Also here to this sculpture by Marisol, some naturalism in the depiction of the eyes and nose and mouth, but then overall we'd say there's quite an abstract or distorted element to the way that she's put the body of this figure together, the rectilinear shapes of the shoulders, etc. with Frank Arbach, getting closer toward non-representation, we can still make out here the head of this woman with her facial features, and yet he is obviously very interested in letting the body of his paint really build up. And it feels very kind of, definitely textured, but sort of scabby, both sensual but also grisly at the same time. And Frank Arbach's paintings, when you see them in person, the paint is usually half-inch off the canvas, just very meaty kind of paint. So he's working his way and getting closer to that non-representational point. And then this work by Kandinsky would be an example of completely non-representational painting. There's no real-world forms being represented here. And Kandinsky was one of the first accredited with completing the first non-representational paintings in the early 1900s. He often made the parallel between instrumental music and non-representational art. And he said that, if in music, in instrumental music, if it can just be about the different sounds coalescing to make this moving experience for your ears, why can't painting do the same? Why can't it be just about shapes and colors and lines, and let go of narrative, let go of themes and figurative objects in the image? So non-representational, or another word for that is non-objective, so not relating to real-world forms. In the rest of this lecture and in our second part of visual literacy, we're going to work our way through the visual elements and principles of design. And so for today, we're just going to be talking about line, shape, figure, ground, and form and space. Line is usually the first thing you start with if you are a young art student or any aged art student going into a beginning drawing class. They often have you start with line drawings. Lines are elements that are around us all the time. So we see the tree branches or the power lines and telephone poles. And of course the lines, when you put them in relationship together, create shapes. And shapes and relationships will create form and space. And so there's a natural progression from line into a more complex spatial drawing. It's helpful here to broaden our descriptive terms, even once you've described, okay, yes, there's line here, but what kind of line would be relevant? So words like geometric versus organic, or rectilinear versus curvilinear can be very helpful. The chair on the left would be more geometric and rectilinear. The chair on the right has a more organic, very curvilinear feel to it. Some might describe it as sort of a lyrical curve. We might also describe a line as being specifically a contour line. A contour line is one that describes the three-dimensional boundary of a form. It describes the three-dimensional boundary of a form. So if you imagine, or you could for the moment, put your hand on the piece of paper in front of you and trace around it, and what you've got there is a nice outline, and that is part of contour. But you notice that your outline of your hand feels very flat, right? Whereas this hand here on the right doesn't feel flat. It actually feels like it has volume. And that's because they're not just describing the outline, the outside contour here, but they're actually going inside the form to give us contours that go across this three-dimensional boundary on the front of the hand, right? Or even in a more kind of simplified, austere version, something as simple as this contour line that goes across the shoulder of the horse is very revealing. It makes us believe that the shoulder is coming in front of the torso, right? So contour lines give us a sense of a spatial boundary. Even in non-representational work like these, we can see these linear forms beginning to tell us about the contour of these forms. So we feel like that they are sort of waving in a breeze or undulating toward us in space. Even in 3 dimensions, it can be interesting and quite beautiful to see contour lines across, say, a landscape in this case. Now, the image on the right you might recognize as part of the Great Wall of China, obviously not built as an artwork for specifically aesthetic contemplation. However, it really functions in quite a beautiful way to tell us about the landscape of China. And here on the left, this was actually built as an artwork by Christo and Jean-Claude called Running Fence. And this fence that they erected across many miles of California landscape really shows us the ebbs and flows of the landscape as this fabric curtain kind of jaunts to the left and the right, up and down through the lilting hills and valleys. So really lovely kind of poetic movement across these landscapes and simultaneously describing the contour. Good artworks should feel something like a roller coaster for your eye. There should be something interesting, right, to move your eye from left to right and all around. And another concern that we often teach to young artists is use of the page or activating the page. So we'll say, how are you going to get the viewer's eye to go all the way from the top to the bottom to every side? Directional lines are one helpful feature. You can take any linear element like this railing maybe, and you kind of skate down on it. Or you kind of are led in almost like a ramp through and then down this pathway, right? All of these linear forms become directional lines. Our eyes want to move across them. And what's beautiful about this photograph by Cartier-Bresson is that he leads us around and back again, and we can kind of keep zigging and zagging, and you really almost form a circuit, your eye does, across. And once you kind of come out through the exit, you just want to go back through again. Right? So this beautiful little loop, your eye doesn't want to leave the page. So those are directional lines, linear forms that lead your eye through the composition. Another way to lead an eye through a composition is through implied lines. So these are not lines that are actually present, linear forms that are actually present, but lines of sight or lines that our eyes create through linking similar forms. Right? So they're not physically present, but they're lines of sight created. So these three yellow hats with the black stripes are very similar forms, and so our eye naturally wants to link them together, right? Or a very potent one when we're dealing with images of people is that we want to know what they are looking at. So this image by Renoir of the boating party, we're very interested to see who is looking at who, right? We notice this man looking down at this woman, who's looking at this man, who's looking across at this woman, who's looking at her dog. And this standing figure seems to be looking generally toward the back, and this woman seems to be looking at the man in brown. And so you find yourself sort of weaving back and forth and around again, just trying to see, well, who's looking at who, and of course reading into it a larger storyline. So implied lines, not physically present, but lines of sight created through similar forms. Now, of course, like we said, lines built to shapes. And with shapes, it can be helpful just to describe something as simple as, are they hard-edged or soft-edged? Because that will give you a very different emotional read. When we look at the image by Mark Rothko on the left, a non-objective work that's dealing with fairly simplified composition of rectilinear forms, the different colored rectangles really almost feel like they bleed into each other very softly, and it feels quite hazy. And so we're likely to see this image as very emotive, perhaps mystic. People have thought of his work as dealing with the sacred. Whereas the one on the right by Ad Reinhardt, similar in its being non-objective and dealing with rectilinear forms, and yet that hard-edged feel, or hard-edged shape, makes it feel much more sort of matter-of-fact, more present, more delineated, a little bit more of a sort of intellectual presence rather than an emotive presence with Rothko's work on the left. Similarly, in representational work, you would want to note the hard-edged or the soft-edgedness of the shapes. So Cailbat's A Day in Paris, Rain, in 1877, is largely made of hard-edged shapes, and so we feel the very tactile presence of these forms, and they feel very true to life, very naturalistic. The image on the right, however, by Georges Seurat of Sunday on the Grand Jatte, feels very soft-edged, and he's actually made this image without any hard edges at all. In fact, it's a pointillistic work, and so it's actually made of teeny tiny dots. This huge work, it's in the Art Institute of Chicago, and it is enormous. It takes up a whole wall. But all these tiny dots give a very soft feeling to the work, so that it feels, I think it has a feeling of kind of nostalgia, a bit of an otherworldliness, or maybe the way that sort of our memories and our mind are a little bit hazy, touched by time and fugitive memories and emotion, right? static and dynamic are another handy pair of adjectives to describe the forms and lines that we're seeing. These two works of architecture are quite dynamic and kind of surprising because we generally live in houses and work in buildings that tend to be very rectilinear, and which feels very stable to us, and that's a good thing. But here we're happily surprised with these very dynamic architectural works that feel as if they are maybe undulating in the breeze. As the top one by Frank Gehry, it feels like it's almost kind of moving or dancing in front of us. And then on the right, Moshe Safdie gives us a rectilinear forms, and yet the way that they are stacked on top of each other feels very dynamic. Now, static versus dynamic, neither of these are inherently good or bad qualities. Generally, artists want them to be in pairs. If things are too static, we might feel a little bit bored by it, but if they're too dynamic, it can almost dissolve into kind of a chaos. So most artists are trying to work with those things in tandem. With Edward Hopper's painting here on the left, we become aware that it feels very static at first, and so we really see that often horizontals and verticals are going to give us that sense of stability or of something being static. Whereas Caravaggio here on the right with the Crucifixion of St. Peter, he's giving us this composition which is actually almost an X, right? You've got this kind of line of sight there, and then this axis here, and it feels very dynamic, right? We move in and out across those diagonals that tend to be dynamic features. We're also moving in and out on what we'll describe as positive and negative forms, or figure and background, so that's very playful here. And then we also have sort of curvaceous forms like going through the body. So curves and diagonals tend to be dynamic, and horizontals and verticals tend to be more static. Now coming back to figure and ground, or positive and negative, we tend to read, we tend to describe the form that is present, or that we interpret as present, as being the positive, and what we describe as like an open space or a background as being a negative. But positive and negative rely on each other to define one another. So you've probably seen some kind of visual games like this one on the left, where you are sort of able to playfully reverse which is positive and which is negative. If you're able to see this shape here, this white shape, as a positive form, a present figure, you might describe it as being the positive form, right? If you are seeing, and if this is positive, then the black would seem negative, right? But if you're focused on this black, feeling like two silhouettes facing each other, then the black becomes the positive figure and the white becomes the negative ground. And that relationship is present in all artwork, but certain artists will, of course, focus on it and make playful compositions, such as this one by M.C. Escher. Whereas we look on the left, we're convinced that this black duck is the positive figure hovering over this white ground. And on the reverse side, the right side, we see that it has slowly become, that the white duck has become the positive figure and the black has become the ground. Take a moment here and even press pause and see how many of these terms you can apply to this image. This is a painting by a French artist named Angra of Napoleon enthroned. And here I would say, when I first see it, I'm very aware of the lines of the two staffs that he has in either hand, and that these two very linear forms create a V shape in the center of the composition. I'm also very aware of curvilinear forms that go through it as well. So you have the back arch of his throne, the half circle of his crown, the half circle of his lace collar, of his chain here, and his mantle. Even sort of curved forms like his arm and the other side of his cloth there. In terms of this, so those are a lot of directional lines. Implied lines, I even make this connection between the top of this staff and then the little hand over here is a strong implied line for me, which also kind of closes off this V into a triangle. It is overall hard-edged, and yet as it goes toward what he wants us to think of as background, he makes the edges more soft to give us a sense of space. Yeah, so I see these curves within curves kind of creating this focal point, but then also where a little bit of these organic lines down here in the linear perspective. All right. We're going to end with just a discussion of form and space. And part of the magic of two-dimensional art, specifically with drawings and paintings and prints, is when you can create the illusion of form and space on an actual flat two-dimensional plane. So we're going to talk about several of the ways to do that. The first is through a contrast of value. Value is the quality of light or dark, or what you might call shading. So here we've got a contrast of value that's creating the sense of form and space. If you juxtapose light values with darker values in just the right way, we give a sense of light hitting a three-dimensional form and casting shadows, right? Or again on our hands on the right, we have a sense of the light coming from above and shadows being cast on the front and bottom of the hands. A second possibility is the contrast of color. And here in this image by Hans Hofmann, there's quite a lot of space created through that contrast of color, where that vivid yellow seems to hover in front of the cool blue-green behind it. Or even that red rectangle underneath seems to hover in front of its blue and green background. So just that contrast of space contrast of color can create a lot of sense of space, even without other spatial cues. Now here overall, this image will read as relatively flat to us. It's a late medieval piece by Cimabue of the Madonna Enthroned. And overall, the stylization here is fairly flat. They're not really interested in too much deep space. But where there is some space, part of it is created by the sense of overlap. Now, of course, we know it's a flat image, so there isn't, these angels don't have bodies, behind one another. But it appears that they do. It appears that this angel is blocking our view of this angel, and she's partially blocking our view of the next one. And so we start to believe that, oh, there is actually space. They are actually full figures back there. So a sense of overlap. Another spatial cue is the contrast of scale. So we see similar forms as here with the ballerina dancers, and we say, okay, this one is larger, these ones are smaller, and that contrast of scale makes us believe that this one is closer and those ones are farther. Right? Location and placement can also be a cue. Now this again is an image that is not using a lot of spatial cues, and so overall it reads as fairly flat. But what they are doing is giving us location. So generally things that are closer to us are going to appear lower down in our field of vision, right? You can test that out just where you are. Your computer, which is probably very close to you, is lower in your field of vision than, the tree out the window or your friend across the room. And so here we have this elephant and horses that are lower in the composition are supposed to read as closer to us than this register up here. Point of view. An artist can also make us feel the space of an image by giving us a unique point of view, as if we feel like we are near the subject. So here Degas has cropped in such a way that we feel like we're sitting at this lower table, and we're just, a hop skipping away from these figures sitting toward the other bench. We feel like we could, pass them the salt shaker. Foreshortening. Now this is a tough one for any artists out there to pull off. It takes a lot of skill. Foreshortening is when we see a long figure shown from a shortened point of view. So when you see this man, the Dead Toreador by Manet from the mid-1800s, we assume that he's a full-length figure, probably 5'10" to 6 feet tall. But we're seeing him slightly from kind of the head looking down toward his feet. And so that gives us a sense of depth, right? Even though it's a shortened point of view. And same here in this beautiful image by Caravaggio of the Supper at Emmaus from the early 1600s. We have the foreshortened arms of this man. And, assuming that he's maybe close to 6 feet tall and that his arm span is then also close to 6 feet, we right away know that, okay, there's at least 6 feet of depth in this painting, right? So that foreshortening, again, really tough to make it convincing when you're seeing a hand and arm at this point of view rather from the elongated point of view, but very convincing when you do it well. Atmospheric perspective is built on the phenomenon or observation of the phenomenon that things that are closer to us appear more defined and more saturated in color, whereas things that are farther away appear desaturated and more hazy. So that is atmospheric perspective. And then the perspective that you guys are also probably very familiar with would be linear perspective. And this is built on the observation that things that are parallel in reality seem to converge as they move away from us. Things that are parallel in reality seem to converge as they move away from us. So as we look at this image here at the bottom of the anonymous or the ideal city, we assume that this plaza with decorated tiles, that these two white lines are actually parallel to each other. But we notice that they seem to be angling in and that they would actually bump into each other or meet approximately in the middle of the painting here. We could also trace these lines off of the building back toward that same archway, right? And so they are actually meeting up at what we call the vanishing point. Up in this diagram, we can see that same vanishing point where all the diagonals seem to meet. And in linear perspective, the vanishing point could be in the center, it could be over to the side. You might not see it, it could be off of the picture plane. And yet those lines of sight convince us that we're dealing with real space, right? Leonardo da Vinci uses linear perspective in The Last Supper, of course, to create the sense of this deep room behind Christ and the apostles. And in this image, it also works beautifully to kind of work as a halo for Christ, that you see these diagonals that all meet, the vanishing point being his head, or we'd say behind his head. And so it feels like a type of halo, even also while acting to create this depth in the image. You can also have 2-point perspective, so there might be 2 vanishing points. And there can also be 3 or more point perspective. Now, especially in the last 100 years or so, artists have been very playful with their spatial cues and really intentionally giving us ambiguous space. And so that can be worth describing when you see images like this one by Terry Winters, where there is a contrast of color and value that gives you an overlap, that gives you a sense of depth, and yet it's not the kind of space that you feel like you could walk into, right? So it's a bit ambiguous. You can't fully map out the space of the image. Or here again with Matisse. He's given us a few spatial cues like overlap, contour line, bit of contrast of scale, and yet this really saturated, intense red on the wall and the tablecloth is very flattening to the image. So he's very intentionally playing with depth and flatness. Here again, pause to see which of these terms you're able to apply here. There's definitely strong contrast of value and color. So we've got the highlights in the front and the dark values in the back. Also more saturated color in the front and desaturated color in the back. Placement on the page, we have figures that are lowered in the image feel like they're closer to us. Point of view, I feel like especially because of the way that there's darkness all around, and then again here in the front, we almost feel like we're standing near this shadowed area in the front, like we're on site. Definitely contrast of scale, foreshortening in the figures on the ground. Atmospheric perspective, again, that saturation in the foreground and desaturation in the background. Not a lot of linear perspective, but a bit on the architecture and on this light box here in the center. Right? So overall, Goya here with the 5th of May has given us a sense that has a lot of great depth in it, using multiple different spatial cues. No online journal for this lecture. Instead, you'll find your next assignment when you finish the second part, Visual Literacies Part 2. Thank you.